The mute girl doesn't know the miracle doctor is her mother. Rainy night outside an old orphanage gate. A small basket with a newborn girl wrapped in a thin blanket, folded scrap of paper with 2 words. "Forgive me." The caretakers found her in the morning, startled by how silent she was. She did not cry. She did not gurgle. Tests later confirmed what everyone soon whispered. The child was mute. She was named Temalalu because they believe she is from God. 3 years later, an old woman named Mama Bissy walked into the orphanage. Her hair was white, her back slightly bent, but her eyes were warm and steady. She had no children of her own and a quiet house that felt too empty. When she saw the little girl sitting alone with a ragged doll, something pulled at her. People told her the child could not speak. They warned her it would be difficult. Mama Bissy only smiled and said, "She needs a home." She signed the papers that day and took the child home, calling her Temi. The first years were kind in their small way. Mama Bissy had little money, a tiny room with 1 window, a kettle that always hummed on the stove. She taught Temi how to stir porridge and how to fold cloth. She hummed lullabies into the child's ear even though the child could not sing back, and Temi would watch the old woman's lips and imagine how sound might feel if it could live inside her. But the world outside that small room was not gentle. School began when Temi was 6, and curiosity quickly turned into cruelty. The other children watched her until they were bored, and then they laughed because she could not answer the teacher. They called her names dumb, ghost, freak, and found small ways to hurt her. One boy grabbed her lunch and threw it into a puddle. Another pushed her while she walked home and laughed when she stumbled. The sting of those moments lived in Temi's chest long after the sun went down. She would sit on the stoop, trace shapes on the ground with her finger, and write the words she could not speak into a small notebook Mama Bissy bought with the little money she could spare. As she grew, the harassment grew with her. At 8, girls refused to let her join their game of skipping rope. At 9, a teacher scolded her for not reading aloud and assumed she was lazy. Once, during assembly, a child mimicked her in front of everyone and the room erupted with laughter. Temi retreated to the bathroom and pressed her forehead against the cold tile, letting silent tears fall. She could not call out that it hurt. She could only clutch the towel and breathe until the laughing faded. The pain was not only in school. Neighbors whispered on porches and spat the kinds of words that stain a mind. At the market, women would clutch their children to their breast when she passed, shaking their heads. "Unlucky," they said, or "not right." Their faces hardened when Mama Bissy walked by with Temi, and they pretended not to see them. Once, a man crossed the street to avoid sharing a bench with them. Each small rejection stacked up like stones until Temi felt she might drown beneath them all. By the time she was 11, Temi began to rehearse small acts that might make her less of a target. She learned to read lips and care for little injuries so other children would not call her helpless. She trained herself to hold her gaze steady so they could not see the tremor in her hands. She read any book she could get, tattered novels, old newspapers, scraps of magazines, learning the world through other people's words. She learned to write fast, to send notes across desks as if language could be delivered in paper and pencil. When she was 12, a cruel prank left her humiliated in front of the whole class. Someone smeared ink across her exercise book and then accused her of vandalism. The teacher, not listening to her gestures, punished her with extra homework and extra chores. She walked home that day like a ghost, hands empty, face numb. That evening, she pressed her forehead to the window and stared at the rain as if the world were a sheet of glass she could disappear into. Mama Bissy caught her and simply held her until the trembling stopped. Between 13 and 15, the life of small wounds became a life of deeper pain. Friends were rare. A few reached out, briefly, then moved away when the difficulty of understanding Temi's silence proved too much. Gossip grew teeth. Boys who might have been kind used her silence for jokes. Neighborhood children dared one another to go up and whisper mean things into her ear, and she would pretend not to hear to spare herself the performance of answering. Once a group of girls spread a rumor that she had cursed a teacher, and the teacher's attitude grew even harsher. She began to dread the school bell and to fear the way voices spilled across a room. Those middle years were full of nights when she wished the silence would swallow her entirely. She wrote in her notebook until the pages bulged with emotion. Angry lists of why the world was wrong, detailed accounts of each insult, drawings of the only places she felt safe. the kitchen where Mama Bissy hummed while she cooked, the little patch of earth behind their home where a pomegranate tree grew and one could hide in its shade. She wrote letters she never sent, beginning each with "Dear World," and then tearing them into tiny pieces after. Tried to learn to sing. It started as a foolish hope. If she could make one small sound, perhaps people would stop seeing the lack and see the person. Mama Bissy would sit at the edge of the bed when the night was quiet and teach her the beat of a lullaby, showing with hands how breath could shape sound. Temmie would practice, lips moving, throat trembling, practicing vowels like a secret. Once, late at night after everyone slept, she managed a single note, a brittle, wavering tone, and for a moment she felt it reverberate in her bones. She rushed to show Mama Bissy, who cupped her face and cried, soft and grateful. But the next day the boys at school mocked the effort, and that fragile note felt stolen from her by their laughter. The attempt to sing left her rower than before. It was another small failure made public. Mama Bissy, who had carried Temmie from the orphanage with pride and no hesitation, grew older and more tired as the years passed. She worked longer hours selling goods at the market, sometimes taking food in the afternoons and others, children's odd jobs to make ends meet. She sold the few things she treasured slowly, quietly, keeping a small pot for emergencies. The weight of stress settled on her shoulders like a blanket. One year after another of worry and work, she began to cough in the mornings, and the cough soon turned to nights of fever. A doctor said it was a strain of pneumonia aggravated by age and hardship. The neighbors, who had once turned away from Temmie, watched as the woman they had whispered about climbed slowly into a bed covered with thin blankets. It was then, watching Mama Bissy's frail hand tremble as she reached for a glass of water, that Temmie felt anger and fear knot together. She could not speak the words she felt, "I will not lose you," so she let the actions become her speech. She washed the pots, she fanned her grandmother's face, she learned to find leaves and herbs in the markets that might help with fever. She bartered her small, crafted trinkets for medicine, her fingers working through nights to afford care. There were days when despair came so close the idea of disappearing felt like a kind relief. Once, at 15, Temmie sat on the riverbank watching her reflection and thought of letting the water take her. She stepped close enough that the cool touched her ankle. The sound of Mama Bissy's cough, thin and human from the window of their house, pulled her back. She remembered how that woman had carried her through years of scorn, and how, in the quiet moments when the world was meanest, her one steady heart had never wavered. Temmie fell to her knees on the grass and let the breath come back in ragged, grateful sobs. Those years shaped her like weather shapes stone. They pitted and polished, left scars, and at the same time taught resilience. She learned to notice kindness like a rare fruit. Once a teacher handed her a pencil with a smile and explained a math problem slowly until she understood. And for a week, Temmie carried that teacher's patience like a talisman. Once a small group of children left their toys by the fence with a note, "For you," and Temmie hid the gift in her chest for months, taking it out on bad days like a talisman against the world. When she was 16, the news came like a sudden, impossible sun. A doctor named Dr. Oluwadison, known for her work with children who could not speak or hear, had returned to the region after training abroad. Mama Bissy saved money carefully, sold the last of her small silver, and went to the clinic with Temmie. The building smelled of lemon soap and antiseptic, and the waiting room hummed with nervous energy. Temmie sat quiet and watchful, knowing how to feel hope without expecting it to stay. Dr. Oluwadison was a woman who walked in with calm authority. She studied Temmie with a careful curiosity that did not feel like pity. The treatments were slow and exacting, exercises that trained breath, muscles, and the fine coordination of lips and tongue. Temmie practiced every day in a new way, breathing that felt like a map, sounds built from small pieces, stubborn repetition that tested her patience. Sometimes she failed and wanted to hide. Other times, she surprised herself with a sound she had not expected to find inside her. Then on a morning that smelled of wet earth, Temmie's lips trembled and a sound came out. It was only a small whisper, "Ma," but Mama Bissy, sitting across from her, wept as if the whole world had shifted under her feet. The sound grew, then formed into a word, then into her name. The first full sentence that came shakily from Temmie's mouth was small, clumsy, but luminous. "I am here." It was as if the world had offered her back to herself. The first time in her life, people looked at Temmie and heard more than what was absent. Classmates blinked as she spoke in the classroom. Teachers began to ask her questions again, this time listening. Her notebook, once scrawled with private thoughts and secret lists of bad days, became a place where she practiced verbs and penciled in hopes. The joy, however, did not stop the world's unpredictability. One evening, walking home after an after-school class, a car came out too fast around a narrow turn and struck her. People screamed. She was taken to the nearest hospital. Hands moved quickly, voices shouted instructions. When the doctors ran the tests, they found she needed a transfusion. To everyone's surprise, the only perfect match was a volunteer present at the clinic, Dr. Oluwadison herself. As the doctor sat by Temmie's bedside, watching the blood course through her veins, a childhood image that she had kept sealed burst forward, a memory of rain, a basket, a tiny wrapped bundle left at an orphanage gate. She remembered the night she had been a young woman full of fear, pressured by shame and by family decisions she could not fight. She remembered making the hardest choice of her life and walking away from an infant she could not care for then. The guilt had followed her like a shadow through years of study and work. It was the reason she had spent her life learning how to help the very children she once abandoned. The test results were clear. The DNA matched. Temmie was her daughter. When Temmie woke days later, weak but alive, Dr. Oluwadison sat with her hand held in hers and told the truth. She told of fear and youth, of mistakes and exile, of the choice she had made and the weight she had borne since. The confession came like a tide, raw and painful and earnest. Temmie listened, first with the stunned blankness of someone watching the sky split open, then with tears that were not only for the pain of abandonment, but also for the relief that comes when a secret ends. There were no grand scenes of accusation. Temmie's anger was soft and human, a hurt that had collected for 16 years. She asked the question that had lodged in her for a long time. Why? The answer of fear, of pressure, of what a young woman believed she could not carry did not erase the wound. But it opened a path towards something else, understanding. She forgave, not because memory was kind, but because the absence that had shaped her life needed more than bitterness to fill it. She forgave because Mama Bissy had loved her fiercely, because Dr. Oluwadison had saved her life twice, and because she did not want the pattern of loss to define the rest of her days. Reconciliation was slow. Dr. Oluwadison did not attempt to erase the past. She stepped forward to help build better days. She paid for medicines and arranged for better schooling. She sat with Temmie for long hours, teaching her how to strengthen her voice and how to stand when others tried to push her down. She did not push Mama Bissy aside. Instead, she honored the woman who had raised Temmie with tenderness, calling her often, bringing food, and setting up a small room near the clinic where Mama Bissy could rest in comfort. When Mama Bissy's health faltered under years of stress, it was Temmie who learned to become the caregiver. The girl who had once been silent became the one who boiled water and held the cool cloth to her grandmother's forehead. She whispered to the old woman the words she had practiced. "You are my heart. You kept me." Mama Bissy's eyes, half closed with fever and peace, still shone when Temmie spoke. The roles rotated in a quiet, sacred way. The child who had been saved now saved the one who had given her a life. In time, Temmie grew into a young woman who carried both the softness she had been taught and the hard lines of her survival. She went to university and studied special education, intent on giving other children what she had received too late: patience, tools, and the belief that a voice, once found, could be used to open doors for others. She opened a small center where other mute or struggling children could come and learn. She taught them to read, to write, to shape their breath into words. She told them her story plainly, and then let them tell their own. Dr. Oluwadison lived the rest of her life with gentleness around the edges of the home and the clinic. She never remarried. Her husband had died years earlier, a quiet loss that left a hollow place she filled with purpose. She and Temmie sat together many evenings, talking about mistakes and about how to be brave enough to change. They planted a small garden by the clinic with a pomegranate tree, a stubborn tree that grew in the poor earth, and in its fruit they saw promise. Temmie's voice became a tool for truth. She spoke at schools and in town squares about children like herself, about the damage of scorn and the power of care. People who had once turned away watched her and learned. The neighbors who had whispered grew curious, then ashamed, then supportive in small, halting ways. The boys who once mimicked her came by the center and learned to coax sound from other children's lips with patience. Some small kindnesses multiplied into a slow change in the town's heart. When the end came for Mama Bissy, a gentle night when the fever finally loosened its grip, Temmie held her hand and spoke to her the entire life's worth of thank yous she had been saving. "You gave me breath," she said, voice steady. "You gave me a name." Mama Bissy smiled and in a voice that trembled like a leaf said, "You were always mine." Temmie did not have simple closure. Life does not afford tidy endings. But she had the converging threads of a family rebuilt. The grandmother who chose her, the mother who returned and asked forgiveness, the daughter who became an advocate. She had the scars that told the story of her endurance and the sound of a life that had been given back. Story moved beyond the town, told in whispers and then in broader voices. A story of a mute girl who grew into a woman who could speak, forgive, and heal. It became, in time, not a tale of one life alone, but a living lesson. That people can change, that shame can be turned into service, and that sometimes the hardest beginnings lead to the most fierce and tender endings.